Good early evening. It's Joyful Christian Hermit. Well, I actually think I've sort of crossed a hurdle with this ailment that I've got, but I haven't been speaking today and didn't realize my voice would sound like this. So I won't talk long, but I had mentioned that I would show different books that a person could read of others who have suffered, victim souls of the Sacred Heart of Jesus, or those who had stigmata were called to suffer by God. And I only picked out like 4 or 5. I have so many on my shelf. I cannot recommend enough, though. For those of you who have a chronic suffering, and it doesn't have to be physical, it can be emotional or mental or any major cross in your life where you are primary in suffering, disabled by suffering, or even temporarily. To read some of these biographies is outstanding, and to pick up any other kinds of books that you find. This little book here on self-renunciation, in my blog, I think it's the Catholic Hermit one. I'll try to find out for you, but I go through a lot of this book, and on mortification too, but self-renunciation is a good practice to learn, to renounce ourselves, our pride. Here's some of the chapters here. And I don't know if you can find this or something similar online. This is old, obviously. I got it at a used bookstore. Being ready to sacrifice our reputation, the importance of little things, government of the tongue, necessity of interior recollection, on prayer, on the trials of prayer, has a little chapter here on contemplative prayer, union with God through suffering. That might be a chapter that would be good for me to review and share with you in particular. Of eternal perdition, on vows and their object, all kinds of vows, half-hearted service. This is all on suffering, offering ourselves, to renounce ourselves and learn to have God be all. The meekness of Jesus, the love of Jesus, the interior life of Jesus, Jesus forsaken and forgotten, union with Jesus, the life of Jesus in us. All of these different chapters. Mortification of the mental powers, to mortify ourselves in our thinking that we're so great and intelligent and all. Perfect obedience to God. Considering the interior humiliations of Jesus, and Jesus as an example of obedience. The interior sorrows of Jesus, Christ as victim, the cross of shame, how to submit to God in seasons of great trial, and the greatness of God's mercy, hope for the hopeless. So lots of good chapters here. And I think the one on suffering is one that I ought to talk about here. Let me find it here. Well, union with God through suffering. I didn't bring my little book on victim souls of the Sacred Heart of Jesus, but I write of that in my blog on victim souls of the Sacred Heart of Jesus. Google victim souls of the Sacred Heart of Jesus. Hopefully you'll find my blog on there. And it goes on for a while, different topics on being a victim soul and how to know if you are, and offering oneself as a victim soul. And I've already talked about the different levels, the different types: temporary, primary, secondary, supportive. I thought of another one the other day, and then but it wasn't included. Just a little book like this, and I went through this book in my videos about a year ago. Why Must I Suffer? This is a book of light and consolation by a priest who just wrote his thoughts about why we do suffer in a general theological way and down to personally, individually, in addition to all of the scriptural and theological aspects of suffering. So if you find that video, that will go through this type of thing. But here's some books that you all can find. I just brought like 3 different titles. I'll mention others though. Alexandrina. Here's a young woman who lost her physical body, in essence, in one fell out of nowhere it came. A man who lusted for her. She was upstairs in her room with another couple of women sewing. They were seamstresses in Italy in the early 1900s. And that could probably get, early part of the 20th century. And this man came up and was going to rape them. And rather than be raped, well, 2 of them were able to flee the room. He cornered her. She leapt out the window, deciding she'd rather die, be seriously injured, but probably die, than to be raped. And she ended up breaking her back. She was paralyzed from the neck down for the rest of her life. And this little tiny book, which is Tan Publications, goes through what she went through, adjusting to her suffering and realizing to offer it to God and to accept it. See if I'll read what this back. She was 14 years old. She spent, and she wasn't totally invalid right then, but from her years, after 20 years old, she was an invalid living in the small Portuguese town of Balasar. So she was a Portuguese girl. Like Therese Neumann, she suffered the Passion of Christ on Friday. She actually ended up having the stigmata, suffered terribly, and did for the rest of her life. And so anyway, it's a fascinating book of her suffering, of her acceptance of suffering. And then she had messages from the Virgin Mary. She had a constant message, the same as Our Lady's Passion. Oh, someone's... I'll get back with them later. Anyway, what a great little book to read, to understand someone's personal suffering and how she wed herself to Christ in suffering. Then this is just a short book, but you can find this book in a larger edition. This one's called Christ's Appeal for Love. It is Sister Josefa Menendez. There she is. Let me get this turned around right. Sorry about this. let me get this. Also, she died in 1923, and she was a victim soul of Christ's love. She was in a convent in Poitiers, France, but she's from Spain, and became very much utilized by Christ for suffering, called her to suffer. And she was a victim soul and also a stigmatic. Here's just a little short, this is from Tan Publishing, just a short little description of her life and her accepting suffering. Then, for a man, you want to read one of a saint male, The Mysticism of the Passion in St. Paul of the Cross, by Ignatius Publishers. These are just 3 names here. But Catherine of Siena suffered a great deal. Catherine de Ricci, R-I-C-C-I. We said Catherine of Siena. Bernadette, little Bernadette suffered. Many, but I really liked The Way of Divine Love. That's a larger book written about Josefa Menendez. Then we have Elizabeth of the Trinity, who suffered. Therese, the Little Flower, her story of a soul, talks about suffering and love. There's just so many. I couldn't begin to carry them all in, the ones off my shelves. I need to vacuum. There's been a lot of construction dust. I need to vacuum them anyway. But there's another one in she was from South America. I think another Elizabeth is her name. Of course, Teresa of Avila suffered a great deal, but she was in active works. She was able to push her body through much suffering to found these the convents, 17 of them, in the latter part of her life. In the last, say, 20 years or less of her life, she did. I don't know. I mean, I brought these, just get started. So many victim souls out there to read. I'll get more as I get those swept off, but this gives you the idea of just how you can get started. Look online, but I would get old books and get saints or servants of God. They'll be written with the Christian view of suffering. And the contemporary books I stay away with because it's just everybody else's opinion. And we go through phases where some people think poo-poo about offering suffering or that God calls us to suffering. I was called to suffer. God ordained this life for me. And I didn't know it at first, but I know just in review and how things fell into place and all that He allowed to happen so that I would offer my sufferings and utilize the sufferings for good and then learn to pray with my suffering. So it's become an actually very fulfilling life that otherwise wouldn't be. Even this added suffering of this illness that I can't get over, seemingly. Although I feel a little better today, but frankly, I didn't feel balanced enough to be out there in the living room long picking books off the shelf, because I have construction equipment around too. My big air compressor and nail guns and different things out there, and still some Christmas wreaths that I haven't been well enough to put away. But I washed my hair today. That was a huge effort for me, because this sinus thing that's now in my bronchial has just wiped me. Well, it's still a lot of sinus stuff, has just wiped me out. I don't have energy, but I could just bring armloads of books, because I collected victim soul biographies, and some had three, like even Agnes of Rome, a child who suffered way back, early centuries. Just that one, I think, included Bernadette as one of them. There was another one. The editor was Francis Parkinson's Keys. It's a 3-in-1, a trilogy of those who suffered. And then I have other books that just discuss suffering. But mostly the books I have sections, just a chapter here or there of suffering and offering suffering, except for my book on victim souls of the Sacred Heart of Jesus. And that goes more into it seriously, of offering ourselves as a victim soul. And I don't recommend doing that unless you've been given suffering, offered suffering by Christ, something that is that he hasn't healed. And you can still pray for healing up until your last breath. But I finally came to accept that we're all going to die of something sometime, and that it doesn't matter if it's a suffering of, now I'm 40 and a half years of suffering, or if it's going to be longer. I had, oddly, a lot of sufferings growing up, odd sufferings along the way, different things that would happen. And as I look back, they were little foretastes of the feast to come. I have learned to view suffering as a positive, and nothing that is ugly, or that it's a way of life that God allows for me, chose for me, and called me, because suffering has great power, energy, and much love if we unite our sufferings with Christ. Look what Christ was able to accomplish. And God allowed his own Son, allowed himself to come to earth as a human, to suffer and die for us, and to show us how to suffer. Because suffering is a part of life, whether or not we want to admit it, or whether we want to fear it. We can choose to fear suffering, dislike suffering, do all we can to avoid it. Yes, I don't think we should just do, that's masochistic, to harm ourselves, or to, like if I would go out without a coat on or something and get chilled all over, get really sick, more sick, that would be sick. So no, and do all we can to control the suffering, to alleviate it. But in my case, I know the chronic condition, there's no cure for it. And so we can learn to embrace suffering. And everyone suffers at some time or another. And it's good to understand suffering in a spiritual, prayerful, loving light. Christ's light of suffering. Christ's view, God's view of suffering. And then embrace and work with it when it comes to us, because it will to everyone at certain point times in their lives, even if it's very temporary. That's one thing that we're all united in, is we will all face suffering. Might be emotional, that of rejection, or physical, mental sufferings at different times of our lives. Grieving is a suffering. Embrace it. Offer it to God. Offer it as prayer. And rejoice of the whole spectrum of life and death when we grieve. Like my good friend who passed away so suddenly. I was thinking of her today and how grateful I was that I got to know her in life. And I think of her enjoying heaven. So it's and praying for all of us. So, and she knows, she's aware I've got this added suffering that I'm not able to throw off very quickly. Just keeps moving around in the respiratory areas. So God bless his real presence in us. And you can look online to start with. There's lots of biographies. Look up victim souls, and or saints who suffered. Google that, and you'll get a good place to start. And then if you find one that's interesting, you do far better getting their biographies or a book such as this in depth about them. And you will learn so much about their lives that way. Talk to you later.